The torches of Ravenspire Keep burned amber against a black mountain sky, and the smell of roasted boar and mulled wine drifted through the long hall like a living thing. Banners hung from the rafters, 5 colors for 5 allied packs, stitched decades ago by hands nobody remembered, their threads gone soft and silver with age. Wolfsbane wreaths ringed the pillars, more tradition than protection now, though the old families still murmured that the long night feast was the one evening a year when the veil between the packs and the things they used to fear grew thin. Snow had started at dusk. It caught in the open rafters and melted before it touched the floor, hissing faintly against the great hearth fire. Laughter rolled across the hall in waves, lords in furred cloaks, ladies in jewel-dark velvet, hounds and half-grown pups weaving between boots. Somewhere a fiddle tuned itself against a drum. The whole keep smelled of cedar smoke and clove and old stone, and beneath it, so faint most noses missed it entirely, something colder. Something that did not belong to any pack in the hall. Nobody noticed that scent yet. Nobody was meant to. This was the night the 5 packs renewed their old treaty beneath the Thornwood Accord. The night alliances were sealed, and betrothals announced, and old grudges set aside, for exactly as long as the wine lasted. It was also, though very few people in the hall would have said so aloud, the night the Alpha King was expected, for the first time in 6 years, to walk through those doors. In the scullery corridor behind the kitchens, none of that mattered yet. There was only the work. Wren Ashdown knelt on the cold flagstones, with a needle between her teeth, and Lady Isolde Rook's hem bunched in her fists, mending a tear no one else had noticed before the girl went out to be admired. Wren's fingers moved without her watching them. In, through, pull, knot. The same motion she'd made 10,000 times since she was 12 years old, and her aunt had first put a needle in her hand and said, "Useful girls eat." She was 23 now. She had been mending hems and cloaks and the small disasters of other people's finery for 11 years, and in that time, she had become something like furniture, present in every important room in the keep, and seen by almost no one in it. "Hold still," Wren murmured around the needle, and Isolde huffed and shifted her weight, and went right on talking to her cousin, as though Wren were a chair that happened to sew. That was fine. Wren had stopped minding a long time ago, or had told herself so often enough that it had started to feel true. There was a peculiar safety in being overlooked. No one watched a girl who wasn't worth watching. No one asked her hard questions. No one noticed when her eyes lingered too long on the doorway, waiting for a man who had made her a great many promises over a long, warm summer, and had not, in 3 weeks, said a single word about any of them in front of another living soul. She tied off the thread, bit it clean, and smoothed the velvet flat with the heel of her hand. "There," she said. "It'll hold." "It had better," Isolde said, already moving away, already forgetting Wren existed, the way everyone in this hall eventually did. Wren gathered her sewing kit into its worn leather roll and stood, rubbing the ache from her knees, and allowed herself one long look at the hall beyond the archway. The candlelight, the noise, the warmth she was never quite inside of even when she was standing in the middle of it. She had learned to be unseen. She had never learned to disappear. There was a difference, though she could not have said, that night, why it mattered so much to keep the two apart. She smoothed her plain gray dress, tucked a loose curl of dark hair back into its pin, and went to find her place at the edge of things, where she always stood. Calm Draven found her there 20 minutes later, in the shadow of a pillar hung with silver wolfsbane, and for a moment, just a moment, Wren let herself believe the summer had meant what he'd said it meant. He was beautiful in the way that Pack Lord's sons were bred to be beautiful. Golden-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed in blue-black wool that made his eyes look like river ice. He had courted her in secret since midsummer, in the orchard behind the kitchens, in low voices after the hall had emptied, with a softness she hadn't expected from a man who would someday inherit half a pack's territory. He had told her, more than once, that rank was a fence built by frightened old men, and that he did not intend to live inside it. "You look tired," he said now, which was not what she had hoped he would say. I've been sewing since noon. You always look like that when you've been working too hard. He said it fondly, the way you might say it to someone you loved, and for one more foolish moment, Ren let the warmth of it sit in her chest. I have to speak to my father tonight, he went on. About arrangements. For the alliance. I know, she said, because she did know, in the careful, unspoken way that servants know everything a full season before it's announced. She had heard the whispers in the laundry for weeks. Rooklands bordered Dravenlands along the eastern ridge, and a marriage would end 40 years of boundary disputes in a single ceremony. It was the kind of match that got written into treaties, not diaries. Ren. You don't have to explain it to me, Colum. She kept her voice even. She was good at that, had been good at that her whole life, keeping her voice even, while something underneath it strained like a seam about to give. I always knew what this was. He looked, for just a moment, like he wanted to argue that. Like he wanted to tell her it had been more than that the orchard and the low voices, and the 6 words he'd once whispered against her hair, had meant something real. But a herald's horn sounded from the dais, clear and bright over the noise of the hall, and whatever he might have said died in his throat, and he only touched her hand once, briefly, before he walked away toward the front of the room, toward his family, toward the future that had already been decided for him by people who had never once asked Ren Ashdown's name. She watched him go and did not follow. The announcement came the way such things always did, with ceremony, with wine lifted high, with 2 fathers clasping forearms in the old way, while their children stood beside them, looking like carefully arranged furniture themselves. The union of House Draven and House Rook, Lord Draven called out, and his voice carried easily over the hushed hall, sealed this long night, in the old custom, before every pack bound to this accord. Isolde Rook, resplendent in the gown Ren had mended not an hour before, took Colm's offered hand with a smile that looked entirely genuine, because, Ren understood, watching from the shadow of her pillar, it likely was. This was not cruelty. This was simply the shape the world had always taken, and Ren had simply, briefly, forgotten to expect it. The hall erupted into applause, and the clink of raised cups. Somewhere, a horn joined the fiddle. Ren stood very still at the edge of the crowd, her sewing roll clutched against her side like a shield, and did not make a sound. She thought, distantly, of all the small kindnesses of the summer, the way Colm had once carried her mending basket up 3 flights of stairs, so her arms wouldn't ache, the way he'd laughed at something she'd said, and looked, briefly, astonished by his own laughter. None of it had been a lie, exactly. It had simply never been meant to survive contact with a room like this one. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears, in a crowded hall, were a kind of noise, and noise was the one thing a girl like her could not afford to make. So, she stood with her spine straight, and her face composed, and let the moment pass through her like cold water through a stone, leaving her, when it was done, exactly where she had started, only colder. She had learned to be unseen. She had never learned to disappear. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, she wished she knew how. The doors at the far end of the long hall opened without a herald's announcement, and the whole room changed before anyone had turned to look. The fiddle faltered, the laughter thinned. Somewhere near the hearth, a hound that had been sprawled contentedly by the fire, lifted its head, ears pinned back, and made a low sound in its throat that was not quite a growl, and not quite a whine. Ren felt it before she understood what she was feeling, a pressure at the base of her skull, like the moment before a storm breaks, though the hall was warm and windless and full of candlelight. She turned, along with everyone else, toward the doors. He stood there for a moment before he moved, framed by torchlight and falling snow, tall enough that he had to bow his head slightly beneath the arch. Alpha King Kael Vaneth wore no crown. He needed none. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of him, that made every other man in the hall look, by comparison, like he was trying too hard. 6 years. 6 years since he had last set foot inside Ravenspire Keep, since the tragedy no one spoke of aloud had taken him north to the Vaneth stronghold and kept him there, ruling by messenger and proxy, while the pack speculated in low voices about whether their king had simply stopped wanting to be seen. He was dressed plainly, dark wool and dark leather, nothing that announced his rank, except the way the room bent around him without being told to. He walked into the hall, and the crowd parted the way water parts, and Ren, who had spent 11 years perfecting the art of being exactly where no one was looking, found, with a small and unfamiliar jolt of panic, that his gaze had gone straight to her. Not to Isolde in her fine mended gown, not to Lord Draven, puffed with the pride of a fresh alliance, not to any of the pack lords angling for his attention with practiced bows. To her, a serving girl in gray wool, standing half in shadow at the edge of the room, sewing roll clutched to her chest. He had not been told who she was. No one had pointed her out, no herald had spoken her name, and yet his eyes found her the way a compass finds north, instantly, and without apparent effort, as though some part of him had been searching for this exact spot, in this exact room, long before he'd ever walked through the door. Ren did not look away first. She told herself, later, that this was pride. In the moment, it felt more like being unable to move at all. He crossed the hall toward her, and the crowd's murmur rose and fell around his path, like a tide he did not seem to notice. Up close, he was even more still than he had seemed from across the room, the kind of stillness that came from a great deal of restraint, not a great deal of calm. His eyes were a pale, changeable gray, like water under cloud. He smelled, faintly, of pine and cold iron, and beneath that, something that made Ren's pulse do something strange and unfamiliar in her throat. "You're the one who mends the Rook girls' gowns," he said. It was not quite a question. His voice was low, unhurried, pitched for her alone in a room full of people straining to overhear anyway. "Among others," Ren said, and was faintly astonished to hear that her own voice came out steady. "I mend a great many things, my lord. It's rarely worth remarking on." "I'd remark on it." He tilted his head, studying her in a way that felt less like appraisal and more like recognition, as though he were trying to place a face he already knew from somewhere he could not name. "You held your composure very well during the announcement." Heat crept up her neck, so he had seen that too, had walked in during the worst moment of her evening, and noticed, of all things, that she had not cried. "It wasn't difficult," she said, which was a lie, and something in the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth told her he knew it. "What's your name?" "Ren, my lord. Ren Ashdown." He said it once, quietly, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. Ren Ashdown. Then, after a pause that stretched a beat longer than comfortable, he added, "I don't suppose you'd tell me why I can smell you from across a crowded hall, over roast boar, mulled wine, and 40 other wolves." Ren blinked. "I couldn't say, my lord. I'm afraid I'm not aware I smell of anything in particular." "No," he said, low, almost to himself. "I don't suppose you would be." And then, before she could ask what he meant by that, a voice cut smoothly across the space between them, warm with amusement, and entirely unbothered by the tension it interrupted. "Forgive me," said the newcomer, sliding into the space beside the king with the easy confidence of someone who had done exactly this 100 times before. "But if my king is going to abandon every diplomatic obligation in this hall to interrogate a seamstress about her perfume, someone ought to at least introduce him properly first." He was shorter than Kale, leaner, with a quick, clever face and dark eyes that missed nothing. He bowed to Ren with a flourish that was only half mocking. "Ro Ashgrave. Second to the Alpha King, keeper of his schedule, and, this evening, apparently, his manners. You'll have to forgive him, he doesn't get out much." "Ro," Kale said, in the tone of a man long past being embarrassed by his second. "I'm simply saying," Ro went on, unbothered, "that the man hasn't left the Vaneth stronghold in 6 years, and the first thing he does upon rejoining polite society is corner a girl by the hearth and ask about her scent. Some of us worry about him." He looked at Ren, something more searching beneath the easy humor now. "Though I'll admit, I noticed it too, the moment we walked in. Faint, old, like something out of a story nobody tells anymore." He paused. You wouldn't happen to know much about your mother's side of the family, would you, Wren Ashdown? The question landed strangely, like a stone dropped into still water. Not much, Wren admitted. My mother died when I was small. The records were incomplete, I was told. It's not an unusual story in the keep. Something passed between Roe and Kale. Quick, wordless. The kind of look shared by two people who had known each other long enough to hold entire conversations without speaking. Roe's easy humor didn't vanish, exactly, but it sobered at the edges. No, Roe said quietly. I don't suppose it is. The hall had gone very quiet around them, Wren realized. Not silent, but hushed, the way a crowd goes hushed when it senses something is about to happen and does not want to miss it. Lord Draven had drifted closer, Isolde on his arm, calm a pace behind them both, all three watching the Alpha King stand very near a serving girl, with an intensity that no one in the room quite knew how to interpret. Kale did not seem to notice them, or if he did not care. He reached into the collar of his coat and drew out something small. A pendant on a leather cord, dark wood carved into the shape of a crescent moon, old enough that its edges had gone soft and smooth with handling. It looked, Wren thought, like something a man might carry against his skin for a very long time, before deciding what to do with it. This belonged to my mother, he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried through the stillness of the hall, as clearly as if he'd shouted it. She wore it the night she died. I have carried it for 6 years, without knowing why I couldn't put it down. He held it out, not quite touching her, an offering, rather than a demand. I'm not commanding anything of you, Wren Ashdown. I want to be plain about that, in front of everyone in this hall, so there's no mistaking it later. I'm asking, if you'll wear this, I'd count it an honor. If you won't, I'll walk away and trouble you no further, and no one here will think less of you for it. The hall held its breath. Wren felt every eye in the room settle on her at once, the way no eyes ever had in 11 years of being furniture. And for one dizzy moment, she understood that whatever she said next would change the entire shape of her life. She looked at the pendant. She looked at him, his stillness, the restraint visible in every line of him. A man who had crossed a crowded hall for reasons he plainly did not fully understand himself, and had still, at the final moment, chosen to ask, rather than simply act. I'll wear it, she said slowly, on one condition. A ripple went through the crowd. Even Roe's eyebrows rose. Name it, Kale said, and there was no impatience in it at all, only attention, complete and unhurried. Whatever this is, Wren said, whatever you think you're seeing when you look at me, I won't be a mystery you solve and set aside once you've solved it. If you want me to wear this, you'll tell me the truth, all of it, as soon as you know it yourself. I've spent my whole life being the last to know things that were about me. I won't do it again, not even for a king. Something shifted in his pale eyes. Surprise, she thought, and beneath the surprise, something that looked almost like relief. Agreed, he said, without a heartbeat's hesitation. You have my word, Wren Ashdown. Whatever I learn, you'll learn it with me, not after me. She stepped forward, into the space between them, and let him fasten the cord at the back of her neck. His fingers were careful, deliberate, brushing her skin no more than the knot required. The wooden crescent settled cool against her collarbone, and the hall exhaled around them, 100 conversations rushing back in to fill the silence, though none of them, Wren suspected, would be about anything but this for weeks to come. Across the room, calm Draven watched with an expression Wren couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, not exactly, though there was something raw in it, more like the look of a man recalculating a sum he'd thought he'd finished long ago and finding it came out different the second time. Isolde's hand tightened, briefly, on his arm, and when he glanced down at her, something passed between them too. A small, private conversation about the woman he'd almost loved before duty had made the choice for him, and the woman standing near him now, whose future he had, without meaning to, just become slightly less certain of. Lord Draven cleared his throat and murmured something about congratulations to the rook match, about the evening growing late, about matters requiring his attention elsewhere. The practiced retreat of a man who had misjudged which alliance in the room mattered most, and was already recalculating his approach for the morning. Ren watched them go and felt, strangely, nothing at all like triumph. She had spent the walk from the pillar to this spot, bracing for the sharp, bright satisfaction of being chosen, in front of the man who hadn't chosen her. And instead she felt only a quiet, clean sort of stillness, the way a room feels after a door has finally, gently, been shut. Calm's choice had been made before tonight, made by fathers and boundary lines, and 100 years of politics that had never once consulted either of them. There was nothing left to win from him. There never really had been. She touched the crescent at her throat instead, and looked up, and found the Alpha King already watching her. Not with triumph either, she noted, but with the same careful attention he'd shown since the moment he'd walked through the doors, as though he were still trying to work out a question the rest of the hall had already stopped asking. It was Ro, 3 days later, who finally gave her the shape of the answer, not with ceremony, but over 2 cups of strong tea, in a small solar off the eastern tower, where the fire crackled low, and the wind outside had turned the falling snow to something sharper. "There was a woman once," Ro said, turning his cup slowly in his hands, "generations back, before any of the Accord packs had names worth remembering. The old stories call her the Moonbound. Not pack, not quite human either, though no one agrees anymore on what she truly was. What the stories do agree on is that she found something in these mountains, something old and hungry, something that had been sleeping under the stone since before wolves walked upright at all. And she bound it, sealed it away with a working that cost her nearly everything, and she tied that seal to her own bloodline, so that as long as her descendants lived and remembered what they carried, the thing beneath the mountain would stay asleep." Ren sat very still, the tea cooling in her hands. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything, we think." Ro's voice had lost all its usual playfulness. "The URLL, the Vaneth line, has carried the burden of guarding that seal for as long as anyone's kept records. That's the old duty behind the Alpha King's title, older than the Accord itself, though most of the packs forgot the reason for it generations ago. But a seal like that isn't meant to be carried alone. It was built to be shared, tended by 2 bloodlines together, the Guardians, and the ones who first bound the thing. When the Moonbound line thinned, when its descendants scattered and married outward and were forgotten by history, the seal grew heavier on Vaneth's shoulders than it was ever meant to bear alone. Kale's mother felt it weakening in her last years. It's part of why she died the way she did. It's part of why he shut himself away for 6 years afterward, trying to hold a working meant for 2 people with only the strength of one. Ren's throat had gone dry. "And you think We think your mother's line was moonbound," Ro said gently. "Hidden, generations back, deliberately. Records altered, names changed, girls married quietly into serving families, where no one would think to look for anything but a maid's daughter. We think it was done to protect that bloodline from packs and outsiders who'd have used it, or worse, tried to end it, if they'd understood what it was truly worth. It worked, for a long time, but it also meant that when the seal needed tending again, no one alive knew where to look." He met her eyes. "Kale didn't choose you because of politics, Ren, or because of anything you did or didn't do. He walked into that hall, and his instincts recognized, in you, the other half of a working his family has carried alone for 6 years. That's the scent. That's the pull he couldn't explain. It isn't a curse you caused. It's a wound in his family, that your family was never meant to be forgotten from healing." Ren sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping softly in the grate, snow ticking faintly against the shuttered window. "That's not the same as choosing me," she said finally, quietly. "That's just being needed." "No," said a voice from the doorway, and she turned to find Kale there, having entered without her noticing, still and careful as always. "It isn't the same. Ro's right about the seal. I won't pretend otherwise, not after what I promised you in that hall, but I noticed you before I understood any of it. I crossed that room because something in me recognized something in you, and I have spent 3 days since trying to work out how much of what I feel is instinct and how much is simply you. I don't have a clean answer yet. I only have the truth, which is what I promised. The rest, I think, we'll have to learn together, the same way you asked." Ren looked at him for a long moment, at the careful honesty in his face, the absence of any attempt to make the truth prettier than it was, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed him. The weeks that followed did not resolve into anything as simple as a fairy tale, and Ren was, in a quiet way, glad of it. There were difficulties. The pack lords who had known her only as a seamstress did not easily accept a serving girl as anything more, and there were sharp words exchanged in corridors she wasn't meant to overhear, old families murmuring about proper blood and proper lineage, without understanding that hers, if the old stories held true, ran older than any of theirs. Kale did not fight those battles for her. He had learned, in 6 years of solitary rule, that a king who fought every battle for the people beside him only taught them never to fight their own, but he stood beside her in the ones that mattered, steady and unhurried, and let the rest teach her what she was capable of on her own. She learned, slowly, what it meant to carry half of an old working she had never asked for. The moon-bound blood in her ran quiet most days, a low hum beneath her skin she'd mistaken her whole life for nothing more than an unusual chill in cold rooms. Under Ro's patient tutoring, half-genuine instruction, half-running commentary that made her laugh more than she'd laughed in years, she learned to feel the seal beneath the mountain the way Kale had always felt it, not as a burden, once she understood it, but as a kind of quiet, steady note beneath everything else, like a low string on an instrument that made all the other strings ring truer. She kept sewing. No one asked her to stop, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't want to. There was a kind of peace in the needle and thread that she wasn't ready to give up, simply because her circumstances had changed, and Kale, when she told him so, half-braced for an argument, had only nodded and said that a woman who mended things for a living seemed, to him, exactly suited to help mend whatever needed mending in a kingdom that had spent 6 years neglecting its own seams. Calm Draven married Isolde Rook in early spring, in a ceremony Ren attended without flinching, seated with quiet dignity beside the Alpha King, and feeling, watching the two of them exchange their vows, nothing sharper than a faint, distant warmth for a season of her life that had ended exactly when it was supposed to. Calm caught her eye once, across the hall, and inclined his head, not an apology, not quite, but something like one. And Ren returned the gesture and let it go, cleanly, the way she'd let it go the night it happened. She and Kale did not rush. He asked her, formally, only after months had passed, after she had learned enough of what she carried to say yes, with her eyes open rather than her instincts alone, after she had tested, in a dozen small ways, whether the restraint she'd first seen in him in a crowded hall was truly the shape of him or only a performance for an audience. It was not a performance, he asked, every time it mattered, rather than assumed. He waited for her answer, as though it were never a foregone conclusion, even when, by then, it plainly was. Snow was falling again on the morning Ren stood at the window of the eastern tower, a full year almost to the day since the long night feast that had upended her life, and watched dawn come up gray and gold over the mountains that held, somewhere beneath their old stone roots, a seal she now understood herself to be part of keeping. The crescent pendant hung at her throat still, worn smooth now by a year of her own handling rather than his. Behind her, the fire had burned down to embers, and the keep was quiet, in the particular way it went quiet, only in the hour before the household woke. A stillness she had once spent alone, unseen, at the edge of every room she stood in. She was not unseen anymore. She had not, in the end, needed to disappear to survive the year that had followed that first snowfall. She had only needed, finally, to be looked at by someone willing to keep looking, even after the mystery of her was solved, even after the scent, and the seal, and the old bloodline had all been explained away into ordinary, understandable facts. Kale had promised her, that first night, that whatever he learned, she would learn it with him. He had kept that promise in every season since, in small ways and large ones, until keeping it, had simply become the shape of how he loved her. She thought of her mother, whose name she had grown up not fully knowing, whose line had been folded quietly into a serving family generations ago, to keep it safe, and who had, without ever meaning to, handed her daughter a burden and a birthright in the very same breath. She thought she understood her, now, in a way she hadn't a year ago, understood the particular ache of carrying something important that the world had trained you not to mention. "You're awake early," Kale said from the doorway, his voice still rough with sleep, and Wren turned from the window and let herself smile, easily, without calculation, the way she had once been afraid to smile at anyone at all. "I wanted to see the snow," she said. "It's how all of this started, if you think about it. Snow falling through the rafters, and a hall full of people who never once looked at me until you walked through the door." He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without needing to lean into it, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, watching the pale light climb slowly over the white mountains. "I used to think I was cursed," he said at last, quietly. 6 years of carrying a seal that was never meant to be carried alone. 6 years of silence, I told myself was strength. I didn't understand, until that night, that the thing I'd spent so long calling a curse was only ever half a working, waiting for the other half to come home. He glanced at her, something soft and unguarded in his pale eyes. "You were never the source of anything broken in me, Wren. You were the piece that had been missing the whole time." Wren looked out at the snow a moment longer, at the mountains holding their old, patient secret, at the dawn coming up slow and gold over a kingdom she had once served without being seen, and now, in her own quiet way, helped to hold together. "I chose this," she said, softly, more to herself than to him, though he heard it all the same. "Every step of it. I want you to remember that whatever the old stories end up saying about how it started." "I will," he said, and took her hand, and did not pull her anywhere she had not already decided, on her own, to walk. "I'll remember it exactly the way it happened. A girl who was never as unseen as this kingdom believed, and a man who finally learned to look properly before it was too late to matter." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, over a mountain that slept a little more peacefully now than it had in a very long time.